the
I thank the permanent representative of Gabon for
devastated to note the effect the conflict is having on Palestinian and Israeli children. Thousands have perished, while the rest are suffering unthinkable psychological traumas. We underscore that the killing and maiming of children, attacks on schools, hospitals, places of worship, and denial of children's access to humanitarian assistance are all grave violations. We also echo regarding the children being held by Hamas. We reiterate our call for their immediate release and for their special protection needs to be prioritized. President, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza can no longer be ignored. Urgent action is needed. This is why we voted in favor of the General Assembly resolution last Friday at the 10th Emergency Special Session. We welcome the provisions of this resolution calling for an immediate, durable and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. This is the minimum requirement to ensure protection of civilians. Meanwhile, we remain concerned that this Council has been unable to act in the face of this accelerating crisis. We echo the Secretary-General's message that this is a moment. Our immediate priority must be to address the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe and to reverse current escalations. We urge Council members to unite in good faith and act decisively for the sake of regional and international security. We also stress that it is unacceptable that humanitarian actors working through the most life-threatening and extraordinary conditions to protect Gazan civilians also must contend with communications blackouts. Connectivity is of utmost importance, not only to the civilian population, but also so that aid responders can continue doing their critical work. Malta reiterates the call also made in the European Council conclusions for the continued, rapid, safe and unhindered humanitarian access in Gaza, including through humanitarian corridors and pauses. All efforts made by international actors in this regard are welcome. Furthermore, we are alarmed at the precarious developments in areas outside of Gaza. It is critical that the international community works together to prevent a spillover which would further increase internal tensions and destabilize the entire region. Malta underscores that any lasting and sustainable plan for peace in the Middle East must be based on a two-state solution, in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. De-escalation, restraint, and mediation are critical. The longer we fail to address these imperatives, the harder it will become to climb out of the abyss and towards the path of peace. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I thank the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Executive Director of UNICEF, and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs for their briefings. The terrorist attacks by Hamas and other groups against Israel on the 7th of October have triggered an unprecedented crisis. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is tragic. Civilians are dying every day, including many children. The population is going hungry. The lack of water brings with it the risk of epidemics, and hospitals are overwhelmed. It is urgent that unfettered humanitarian access be guaranteed for the Gaza Strip that needs food, water, and electricity. The number of significantly in order to be commensurate with what is needed. A humanitarian truce is needed, which could ultimately lead to a ceasefire. France has significantly increased its humanitarian assistance through the chartering of a special flight last weekend and welcomes the commitment of the Secretary-General, the work of UN agencies, and the work of humanitarian actors on the ground who are working in extremely difficult conditions. Our most sincere condolences go to the United Nations following the deaths of 63 UNRWA staff members. Civilians must be able to leave Gaza without being impeded from doing so, and we have constantly requested that for our own nationals and their families since the 7th of October. Nothing can justify the suffering of civilians who must be protected. All victims deserve our compassion, and all lives are valuable. Israel has the right to defend itself and the duty to do so in compliance with international humanitarian law, sparing the civilian population. France voted in favor of the resolution introduced by Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, which calls for a truce and humanitarian access and for the protection of civilians, which condemns terrorist acts and which calls for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. And I recall our condemnation in the most energetic terms of the terrorist attacks by Hamas, which in no way represents the Palestinians and which has nothing but contempt for their suffering. I also reiterate our call for the hostages to be released immediately and without condition. Following this vote in the General Assembly, this Council must be able to fully shoulder its responsibilities and achieve a just decision based on our common principles. France will continue to work on the new draft resolution presented by Brazil so that it can be adopted quickly. Mr. President, the extreme severity of the situation in Gaza should not lead us to forget what is happening in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. France firmly condemns the violence perpetrated by settlers against the Palestinian population, acts of violence which are increasing in the West Bank. We call on the Israeli authorities to put a stop to this. We must prevent this engulfing the entire region. France remains extremely worried following a launching of a shell that landed in UNIFIL headquarters in the south of Lebanon on the 28th of October. France is committed to avoiding a spread of this conflict. This war has reminded us, as if any reminder were necessary, that the world can no longer ignore the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and security. We all are aware of the conditions for this, namely the necessary security guarantees for Israel and a state for the Palestinians. We must all mobilize in order to restore a political horizon. The only viable solution is a two-state solution, and France will continue its engagement within this Council for it to adopt a resolution as quickly as possible. We owe this to the Israelis and the Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Ms. Dutton for the information provided. We pay tribute to you, your work and your teams on the ground, and mourn the loss of over 60 UN workers fallen in the line of duty. The past 3 weeks have been dramatic for Israelis and Palestinians and tormenting for the Middle East and many elsewhere. The overall death toll in civilian victims is frightening and unsustainable. We extend our condolences and deepest sympathy to the families of all victims, Israelis and Palestinians alike. Mr. President, 7th of October will remain a defining moment in the never-quiet history of the Middle East. Hamas, its brutality and terror, the worst in human behavior, will not and must not be forgotten. In the current utterly complex situation, there is an accumulation of competing urgencies: the response to terror and the continued rocket launches from Gaza, the liberation of hostages, the protection of civilians, the provision of humanitarian help, and the increased risk of spillover of the conflict. Let me quickly go through each of them. First, in its exercise of the right of self-defense, which we recognize and support like for every other country under attack, Israel is determined to eradicate Hamas. It should not be portrayed mistakenly as a license to punish Palestinians. It is beyond any doubt that conducting warfare in such a densely populated area as Gaza is difficult, challenging, very demanding, and it must be conducted prudently, professionally, and in compliance with international humanitarian law. We profoundly regret every innocent life lost without distinction. While circumstances may be different, a loss is always a loss. Therefore, there is need for maximum precaution not to harm those who are twice in danger: First from Hamas and their policies on one hand, and a fight they have not chosen on the other. It is therefore extremely important and urgent to do everything possible that civilian populations are not found in that hopeless place from where there is no escape. Second, nothing can ever justify abducting and holding hostages innocent people, children, women, and elderly. Even less so using them, as Hamas is doing. They must be liberated, they must be brought home. We welcome efforts from various actors in this respect and urge them to continue. Third, unhindered humanitarian help at scale must be urgently provided to all those in need. We cannot contemplate children dying in the hospitals because of the lack of medicine or electricity or water or lack of communications. We cannot contemplate lack of food for entire families, adding to an already difficult situation the total breakdown of law and order because of lack of basic commodities. The government of Israel has promised that soon aid will flow in abundance. It should happen immediately. Those who are spared from the fighting do not need to die from hunger. Colleagues, we try to put ourselves in Israel's shoes, feel the trauma of terror striking with a ferocity we cannot forget, faced with an existential question with countries and proxies that seek openly to destroy it. I don't think anyone here or anywhere would feel at ease knowing that your next-door neighbor is just waiting for the right moment to kill you. How can this not bring back horrible memories, that fear and anxiety summarized in the Never Again pledge? But we also put ourselves in the very same way, in the shoes of the Palestinians, feeling the unexplainable pain of civilians caught in the midst of a war that has befallen on them, a war first imposed by Hamas and the likes, decided elsewhere by their masters who are rubbing their hands in the face of casualties they had anticipated and hoped for in a turmoil of all dangers. We feel for Palestinians who for decades, at every time they neared to the horizon of their future with their state, those against would always be quicker to disrupt it and push it further away. We feel for those thousands on both sides of this terrible divide who have lost their loved ones, the families of the hostages, and all those torn apart by death and grief and the insecurity of tomorrow. Wars are sometimes unavoidable because imposed, but they are always brutal. They bring inevitable destruction. They cause victims and sadly often casualties among those who don't deserve it. But even wars have laws and they must be respected. We believe and trust that there is a way, there is and must be a way to ensure the security of Israel and its people while ensuring the security of the perspective of all Palestinians who do not want war. Colleagues, beyond the tragedy unfolding in Israel and Gaza, the magnitude of the human suffering is impacting people across borders and identities, and we notice a sharp increase in the hate and division, including the threat of terrorism and targeted violence. This sharp and often confusing polarization fails to acknowledge our common humanity, and that the killing of innocent civilians, regardless of religion or ethnic background, is wrong, unacceptable. The frightening images of the bloodthirsty mob yesterday in Dagestan hunting for Jewish people is another appalling illustration of intolerable and appalling rise of anti-Semitism. No one should stay indifferent to allow rallies where people chant "kill the Jews" or "destroy Israel." This is why there is so much need for wisdom, responsibility, and action on the ground and from this Council, because otherwise confusion, hatred, tension, and violence will continue, not only in Gaza and the West Bank, but also elsewhere in the Middle East and beyond, dividing societies, fueled by strong emotions, ideologies, and beliefs, overpowering cold minds and reason, and overshadowing forward-looking perspectives. Last but not least, Mr. President, the serious risk of spillover. Hezbollah is playing with fire, and attacks from the northern border are becoming more and more threatening. If this continues, it may be a matter of time before the irreparable point is reached. It must be resisted, since it will only bring the region and all the countries involved near a catastrophe. In this respect, we are also very concerned for the situation in the West Bank. We condemn the extremist settler violence on Palestinians, which is totally unacceptable. Such acts must be fully investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. Mr. President, in the face of so much complexity and adversity, we think it is urgent to start thinking about the Gaza of tomorrow, the Gaza without Hamas, without extremists. There is need to offer Palestinian civilians in Gaza a perspective, a new organization of life under a new administration. Hamas has let them down. Hamas has brought war to them. Hamas did not bring them prosperity because it invested in hatred and death. We need to start thinking how the fabric of the society can be repaired so that the children know that what shalom means instead of repeating death to the Jews. If not, the Hamas of today will only be replaced by the Hamas of tomorrow, maybe with another name, but with the same hatred, the same ideology, the same goals, embroiled in a never-ending cycle of hurting the other, acting falsely in the name of God they disrespect, and acting falsely in the name of a future they simply oppose. This is why there is a need to revive the political process as soon as possible, because in its absence there will only be unhappiness, poverty, discrimination, hatred, tension, never-ending violence, victims, and as it has happened many times, exploitation by terrorist extremists and their supporters. And let's not fool ourselves. The next war will be only deadlier. But it is preventable if we all work together with conviction and in good faith for peace, for lasting peace. And I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Albania and for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mozambique thanks the Brazil presidents for timely convening this meeting. We also thank the briefers, Mr. Filipe Lazzarini, Commissioner General of United Nations Relief and the Workers' Agency for Palestine Refugees in East, Ms. Lisa Dothen, OSHA's Director of Humanitarian, Financial and Resource Mobilization Division, and Mrs. Catherine Rossell, Executive Director of United Nations Children Fund, for their insight and update on the current situation in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, a glue and tragic situation is taking place in Gaza. We are horrified by reports of suffering and death of children, women, and men in Gaza. It is clear that the protection of civilians in time of war is not being observed. In this context, Mozambique joins our voice with that of many others in reiterating an immediate and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire to ease the suffering of millions of our brothers and sisters, Israelis and Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, we should remind ourselves that the laws of war have established the clear rules to protect human lives, human dignity, and respect humanitarian needs. These laws cannot augur or sidelined under any circumstances. They must be respected and observed by everyone, everywhere, at all times, without exception or excuse. We have condemned attacks on Hamas on 7 October against the Israeli children, women, and men. We strongly condemn the attacks against the civilian populations, in particular children, women, elderly, and the UN humanitarian staff. We call on their protection. That is vital. It is therefore imperative that we continue working together towards ensuring the safety and protection of civilians in the conflict zones. The world looks at us as expertise as a member of this Security Council to respond expeditiously to the situation in the Gaza Strip. The United Nations awaits actions and leadership from this Council. Article 24 of the UN Charter clearly states that, I quote, in order to ensure prompt and effective action by United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, end of the quote. Accordingly, we reiterate our appeal to members of this Council to fulfill their functions and powers, to change the course of actions in the Gaza Strip. Mozambique, as a strong advocate for peace and dialogue in the Middle East region, particularly in Palestine, we echo the United Secretary General repeated calls towards resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is the key to sustainable peace in the Middle East. For this desirable purpose, we firmly believe that the parties can work together through constructive dialogue for a lasting peace in full compliance with the principles of two-state solution based on Security Council and General Assembly resolutions and decisions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Mozambique, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, distinguished Mr. Minister, we fully support the convening by the delegations of the UAE and China of this emergency meeting of the Security Council on the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. We were extremely concerned to hear the assessments of the situation on the ground from the Commissioner General of UNRWA, Filippo Lazzarini, UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell, and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton. Colleagues, the time has come to call things by their names. On the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip, a humanitarian catastrophe of biblical proportions is unfolding. According to incoming information, the number of people killed in the enclave has exceeded 8,000, half of which are children, women, and older persons. More than 2,000 people are buried under the rubble, half of which are also children. More than 21,000 people have been wounded. The number of internally displaced persons in Gaza has reached 1.6 million people. In UNRWA camps alone, there are 640,000 Palestinians. In the West Bank, more than 100 people have been killed and 3,000 have been injured. These chilling numbers are growing by the hour. We express our gratitude to all humanitarian workers on the ground that are working to exhaustion with a catastrophic lack of basic, including medical supplies, and also with an extremely high risk to their own lives. The scale of losses from UN agencies is shocking. 63 staff members have been killed, 22 have been injured, and 42 UNRWA objects have been destroyed. And we pay tribute to the UN staff that continue to work in unimaginable conditions and to those that have paid for this with their lives. According to media reports, during Israeli shelling on the Blue Line, 2 peacekeepers from the UN intermittent force in Lebanon have been wounded. The largest hospital in Gaza, Al-Quds, is under the threat of attack from the IDF. The Israeli Air Force is launching strikes 50 meters from facilities, demanding immediate evacuation. Almost 640,000 IDPs have found refuge in 150 UNRWA sites across the Gaza Strip. As a result of the bombing, 9 hospitals are entirely unusable, and the remaining ones are experiencing an acute lack of medicines. The blockade of the Gaza Strip has essentially become total. In the enclave, internet and mobile service has been switched off. It has been quite simply cut off from the rest of the world. Nobody knows accurately what is exactly happening there. This sort of blockade not only is sowing greater panic among the civilian population, it is directly undermining the work of medical and rescue services, which means it is leading to more civilian casualties. For this reason, it was not possible to agree on the 28th of October for the passage of another humanitarian convoy across the Rafah crossing point. We categorically condemn these actions, particularly in a situation in which, after shutting off communications, the most powerful airstrikes were launched on the enclave since the beginning of this escalation. In the conditions of active hostilities, the humanitarian response remains essentially nominal. Through the Rafah crossing point, the only point from Egypt, since the 21st of October, only 94 trucks have made it through, and according to incoming information, Israel is even stymieing these meager deliveries. As a result, in the Gaza Strip, there is an acute lack of everything: water, fuel, food, medicines, and people are frightened and have been driven to despair. On the 28th of October, upon the decision of the military political leadership of Israel, the armed forces of that country, ignoring the position clearly expressed by the international community in the UN General Assembly resolution adopted the previous day, began a ground operation in the Gaza Strip. After extremely intensive airstrikes, the Israeli army began to enter the territory of the enclave from several directions: in the south near Bureij refugee camp and Khan Yunis, and in the north near Beit Hanun. Colleagues, the Israeli authorities have different ways of describing their actions: expanding operations or preparing a bridgehead. But that's not the point. The point is that despite the unambiguous reaction around the world, West Jerusalem has begun the practical implementation of its plans to clear the enclave. In response, we have heard from the head of the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying that Israel rejects outright the UN's despicable call for a ceasefire. End quote. These comments did not go unnoticed as well, the comments from the permanent representative of Israel saying that UN has lost its legitimacy. There are shocking statements from a number of representatives in the Knesset that have been broadly circulated in the media saying that, and I quote, there is no symmetry in the Israeli response, and that, and I quote, the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, end quote. Unfortunately, this clearly shows that Israel is demonstratively ignoring the opinion of the overwhelming majority of UN members, including many Western states, regarding the need for an end to the violence. This appalling situation has also been brought about because, due to the US position, the Security Council has essentially been paralyzed and has still not been able to adopt a resolution with an immediate demand for a ceasefire. We have twice made attempts to do so, but Washington and Western Jerusalem have entirely other plans: to wipe out the population of Gaza, or to force them out of the Gaza Strip, and to force the remaining Palestinian population to assimilate into Israel so as to resolve the Palestinian problem that way. In the context of the unprecedented scale of the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we also have to note the current rise in tensions on the Syrian-Israeli border, which is linked to the active external interference coupled with the illegal military presence of the USA in the north and northeast of the Syrian Arab Republic. On the 26th of October, US forces, upon the instructions of President Joe Biden, launched strikes on two objects in the Abu Kamal area in the east of Syria. Washington said that the attack was undertaken in exercise of their so-called right to self-defense, American style. And this is thousands of kilometers from US territory. These illegitimate and in no way justified actions by Washington are nothing other than a gross violation of Syria's sovereignty and the norms of international law. In the present circumstances, such an illegitimate use of force could have extremely dangerous consequences because it could provoke an armed escalation encompassing the entire region. Colleagues, the time for half measures and half-hearted glib appeals is past. No humanitarian pauses will help. Humanitarian assistance cannot be provided in the height of hostilities on the ground. I hope that everyone here understands that. The number of victims among the humanitarian workers is running into the dozens. Ambulances have been bombed, and those that are left are unable to operate due to a lack of fuel. All noble humanitarian passages are, of course, important, but in and of themselves, they are not going to stop the war. The priority of the global community now is to stop the bloodshed, to minimize the harm to the civilian population, and to move the situation into the political diplomatic sphere. There must be a consolidation of collective efforts aimed at relaunching a fully fledged negotiating process between Israelis and Palestinians with the aim of realizing the UN-endorsed two-state solution. Upon the basis of that, an independent Palestinian state should be created in the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Mr. President, I would like to ask the permanent representative of the USA a question. Can you explain why you oppose a ceasefire? Does this mean that the USA, as a permanent member of the Security Council, supports the doctrine of a massive retaliation in Gaza? Where is your compassion for civilians that you so eloquently express at every Security Council meeting on Ukraine? And that's even though the lives of civilians in Ukraine are far from facing the same level of threat as Palestinians in Gaza. Or is it that you only think about those who are in the European continent and that Palestinian lives don't stir any emotions in Washington? And I would like to put the same question to the other Western delegations in the Council, who shamefully abstained on all of our draft resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Colleagues, your double standards are more than evident. The populations of your own countries are now calling for an answer to that, where there are mass demonstrations in support of Palestine. In this situation, the Russian Federation is making intensive efforts to de-escalate the situation on the ground, aimed at rapidly resolving the crisis. We have sent a clear signal to all of the parties involved. There must immediately be an end to the fighting and the ensuring of humanitarian corridors for the emergency provision of assistance to all those who need it. And President Putin has been extremely clear. We categorically will not accept and condemn any terrorist acts. We express condolences to all those who have lost their loved ones in Israel and in Palestine and in other countries. But while condemning terrorism and the taking of hostages and demanding their unconditional release, we categorically cannot agree that the threat of terrorism can be responded to while violating the norms of international humanitarian law, including the indiscriminate use of force on objects of civilian infrastructure where civilians are known to be located, and alongside addressing the urgent tasks to end the current escalation of violence, we must immediately begin to agree on a strategy for collective actions for a political settlement to the conflict. In the past, this was done by the quartet of international mediators. However, the USA has done everything to undermine this effective instrument. On the agenda is establishing a collective mediating mechanism with an active role for states in the region. This is supported by the positive trends that before the previous escalation, the current escalation in Gaza, were evident in the Middle East. The Saudi-Iranian normalization, the reintegration of Syria into the League of Arab States, and the steady improvement in interstate relations between Syria and Turkey. All of this proves, all of this proves that the countries in the region are, when they take the situation in hand, and are not subjected to pressure from outside the region, they can achieve a great deal to stabilize the Middle East. Given the growing escalation in the Palestinian enclave and the unthinkably vast consequences for the civilian population, which is cut off from outside supplies, we believe it is important to open briefings such as the one today. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, without any discrimination, must remain within the focus of our constant attention as takes place in the context of other crises. Mr. President, some colleagues trying to shift the focus from the tragic events surrounding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict touched upon the 29th of October incident in Makhachkala airport in Dagestan in Russia. Exhaustive comments on this have already been provided by the Russian leadership and representatives of the regional authorities and the Muslim leadership. Assessing the actions will be provided by the Investigative Committee of Russia, which has launched criminal cases into this disorder. Dozens of people participating have already been arrested and questioned. It's clear that any illegal actions are unacceptable. However, attempts to paint an unsanctioned action in the airport as an outbreak of anti-Semitic feeling in Russian society, particularly in the North Caucasus, is unacceptable. This region has long been an example of the peaceful and friendly coexistence of those from many different peoples. In Russian society, unlike Western societies, the principles of tolerance and religious and racial grounds are well-rooted. In our society, there is the coexistence of the representatives of all of the main faiths: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. As is confirmed by data from the Russian security services, the events in Makhachkala are clearly seen clearly show signs of external interference, including information interference through social networks. And the traces of that, you will be not surprised at all, come from Ukraine. Some wish to abuse the situation and play on the feelings of Muslims in Russia by showing terrible pictures from the Gaza Strip, showing the horrors that are taking place there, the deaths of women, older persons, children, and medical workers. I would recommend that some of our colleagues do not try to shift the blame, but rather that they pay attention to the situation in their own capitals, where there are many Muslim demonstrations that are being brutally put down by the police. This is an example of Western countries' commitment to multiculturalism and freedom of expression. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for your stark and clear briefings. Let me start by recognizing the courage, commitment, and sacrifice of UN employees and humanitarian workers in Gaza, and in particular, the 103 aid workers, including the 64 UNRWA staff who have been killed in Gaza in the last 22 days. We also offer our sincere condolences to all Palestinians and Israelis who have suffered or lost loved ones. Since Hamas' terrorist attack against Israel on the 7th of October, the United Kingdom has underscored Israel's right to self-defense against terrorism. We continue to be clear that this must be done in accordance with international humanitarian law. Our efforts with our international partners have focused on the protection of civilians, securing and scaling up humanitarian access, and the release of hostages. Sadly, despite these efforts, the situation in Gaza deteriorates daily. Hamas bears sole responsibility for starting this conflict. President, I'd like to highlight 3 priorities. First, we call on all parties to respect international humanitarian law, including the principles of proportionality, distinction, and necessity. This requires all parties to take every possible step to avoid the harming of civilians and the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. Second, we must urgently cooperate to scale up aid into Gaza and to ensure sufficient access points are open. For this to happen successfully, there needs to be a safer environment, which necessitates humanitarian pauses. We support UN-led efforts in this regard. Since the latest escalation in Gaza, the UK has committed over $36 million in additional aid to the occupied Palestinian territories. An RAF flight arrived in Egypt on the 25th of October, carrying 21 tons of UK aid for Gaza. But the access environment needs to improve immediately so that these and other life-saving resources can reach the people who desperately need them. Third, we cannot allow this conflict to spread. We call on all countries in the region to help avoid escalation and warn non-state actors not to exploit the current situation. President, the Palestinian Authority has a key role as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. We call on Israel and other states to support the PA. We call on the Israeli authorities to tackle the rising number of settler attacks and killings in the occupied West Bank, recalling that it is their responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians there. The UK retains the long-term goal of a two-state solution with Israel and Palestine coexisting peacefully. To reach that goal, we have a responsibility to ensure a plan for Gaza that offers the population hope, security, stability, prosperity, and effective governance so that their political wishes can be fulfilled. In this regard, some fundamental principles apply. There should be no mass displacement of Gazans to neighbouring countries. The Palestinian Authority should play a central role, and nothing should be done that cuts across progress towards a two-state solution, with Gaza as an integral part of a Palestinian state. Thank you, President.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Japan.
I thank Commissioner General Philip Lazzarini and UNICEF Executive Director Catherine Russell and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton for your briefings. I join other colleagues in expressing our respect to all humanitarian actors who are tirelessly working under unimaginable conditions. Mr. President, since October 7th, thousands of people have been killed and wounded. The tragic sequence of events shows no signs of abating, descending further into a devastating cycle with unimaginable losses of life and the destruction of civilian facilities. Just recently, Israel announced the expansion of its ground operations in Gaza. Japan has been paying careful attention to the situation with grave concern. Japan has expressed unequivocal condemnation to the terror attacks committed by Hamas and other militants and extends its sincere condolences to all victims. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of the remaining hostages. The international community should never tolerate such a heinous act. Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people. Every member state has the right to defend itself and its people in accordance with international law. At the same time, all parties must act based on international law. The deterioration of the situation in Gaza has led to a deepened humanitarian crisis to an unprecedented level of severity. The loss of any more innocent lives, regardless of their nationalities, religions, or ethnicities, is simply unacceptable. No one's life is more important or less important than that of others. Full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access, consistent with international humanitarian law, must be allowed in order to alleviate the devastating humanitarian situation. While several trucks have crossed through the Rafah crossing, hundreds more must follow suit to meet the dire need of over 2 million people. And in this context, we should also take further steps immediately, including humanitarian pauses and establishment of humanitarian corridors. Additionally, we express our profound concern regarding the disconnection of telecommunications networks, which disrupts vital communication channels between those in Gaza and the rest of the world, and also impedes the work of media and humanitarian communities. It is especially imperative to ensure these networks function to ensure the delivery of humanitarian assistance and the safety of humanitarian workers. As the situation is rapidly evolving, it is critical for all parties in the region to avoid exacerbating this conflict. The international community has a duty to redouble its diplomatic efforts in order to prevent the instability from spilling over into the region and to calm the situation with a sense of urgency. The Security Council needs to act urgently to find a common ground among all Council members to deliver a meaningful message and help to all parties, to all in distress. While we remain unable to act, lives are being lost day by day, minutes by minute. We must also recall that ultimately there is no alternative to a two-state solution. All parties must make serious efforts to this end. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, I thank you for giving me the floor. And let me begin by thanking Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Russell, and Director Doughton for their briefings on the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza following the resurgence of conflict in the Middle East after the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas against Israel on 7th of October. 23 days after the attacks in southern Israel, with the attendant loss of lives and abductions, we are appalled by the many lives that are being lost in the ensuing conflict, as well as its humanitarian consequences. We are equally concerned by the potential spread of the conflict to the wider region and the heavy toll that it bodes for innocent civilian populations. Last Friday, within the context of the resumed 10th Emergency Special Session of the General Assembly, majority of the members of this organization, through the residual rule of the Assembly, called for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce, demanded of all parties to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, and asserted the need for continuous, sufficient, and unhindered provision of essential supplies and services into the Gaza Strip. It also called for the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians held captive and demanded their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in compliance with international law. Taking into account what the Assembly has said, we must, as a Council, build upon the convergence of views on this crisis to support the Secretary General, UN agencies, and staff, including UNRWA, to deliver critical care and support services to the nearly 672,000 internally displaced persons sheltering in the 149 UNRWA facilities, as well as the many other innocent civilians who are living under desperate conditions. From recent reports of UNRWA, the number of trucks that are allowed into Gaza, if we are to make any impact in addressing the desperate humanitarian needs of the 2 million people in Gaza, especially in the health and food security components and the supporting supply needs. In this context, we appeal to Israel, Egypt, and other stakeholders to work constructively towards enhanced humanitarian access through the Rafah border crossing, and to all donors to step up financial and material contributions to UNRWA to meet the growing and urgent humanitarian needs of the people of Gaza. We must also use the weight of the Assembly's decision to strenuously encourage the efforts of leaders in the region, especially Qatar, as well as the ICRC, that have been at the forefront of negotiations to secure the release of all Israeli and foreign hostages, to impress upon the Hamas militia to heed the demand of the international community for the immediate and unconditional release of all captured civilians. Holding innocent civilian populations as captives is wrong and unacceptable, regardless of the motives. Mr. President, the past 23 days has also been one of blood, pain, and anguish, as we have not seen in the region in recent times. Not to make further efforts to stop the fighting would be truly tragic. We encourage regional and international leaders to act as moderating influence on the parties to help de-escalate the conflict and prevent its further spread in the region. The impact of the conflict on women, children, and the elderly has been enormous, and we owe it to them on both sides to bring this crisis to an end. In concluding, we reiterate our condolences for all lives lost and remind the Palestinian and the Israeli people of their interwoven history and shared geography, both ancient and modern. The experiences of the past should reinforce the realization that violence cannot be the tool for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Indeed, neither the security interests of Israel nor the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people for their homeland can be secured by violence. For Ghana, and as often repeated, we hold the view that a deepened commitment to a negotiated two-state solution on the basis of the 1967 borders offers the best prospects for peace and stability in the Middle East. We hope that in furtherance of this Council's responsibilities, we can find a consensus to end this conflict, bring the parties to the table of dialogue, and help deliver a secure and assured statehood for both Israel and Palestine sooner rather than later. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Ghana for his statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. My apologies for taking the floor, but I need to respond to some comments made by the Russian permanent representative. Since the beginning of this conflict, the Russian Federation has spared no moment trying to either directly or indirectly blame the United States for this crisis. It is irresponsible. It is false that we are responsible in some way for what is going on. No state has worked harder than the United States to try to resolve this situation, and we continue to work hard to do so. This is a typical Russian narrative that has, again, no basis in fact. Russia, frankly, has no credibility. Its prevarication knows no bounds. It claims to care about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I think it's pretty clear. Russia doesn't care about solving crises, humanitarian crises. It creates them. If you have any doubts, just look what's going on in Ukraine. Regarding U.S. actions in Syria, we responded to attacks against U.S. personnel acting in self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. I think Russia will recall the UN Charter. It has been working to drive a stake through the heart of this sacred document through everything that's been doing in Ukraine. So let me just close by saying, Mr. President, the United States will continue its efforts to do what it can to ease the situation in the region. And my hope is that Russia will step up and be a responsible player in the Security Council and work with the international community to try to bring about an end to this very, very sad situation. Thanks, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. The permanent representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. And taking stock of the latest comment from my American colleague as an admittance, we didn't hear a response to the question that we put to him, but I would like to put a rhetorical question to him, which I don't require an answer to because it's a rhetorical question and the answer is obvious anyway. How many times during the present crisis has the United States initiated a meeting on the humanitarian situation in Gaza? Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I want to begin by welcoming you to this chamber and to leading the deliberation of this emergency meeting requested by our colleagues from the United Arab Emirates and China, which we appreciate. The fact that you are with us for the third time during this month is an illustration of the commitment of Brazil at the level of the foreign minister and I am sure with the urgency from President Lula to do everything that you can in order to bring about the end of this carnage and the tragedy that the Palestinian people are going through, particularly in the Gaza Strip. We, the Palestinian people and the State of Palestine, and our people everywhere, particularly in the Gaza Strip, and our leadership, do really appreciate this commitment, this effort that Brazil is doing. And I am personally delighted to see you for the third time, because I consider you as a good friend from the time when we worked together as permanent representatives of our states. I want also to thank the three briefers: Commissioner General Lazzarini, Executive Director Ms. Russell, and Director Ms. Doughton, for their briefings and for their moving calls. And it is coming from people who are in the field, leading teams in the field trying to save lives of the Palestinian people. We don't only express our gratitude and appreciation for what they do, and also receive with them accepting condolences for those who have lost their lives and paid the ultimate price for trying to save the life of the Palestinian people. They are the best faces of the United Nations. They are the best among us, led by a hero by the name of Guterres, who stood outside the Rafah crossing and made his brave humanitarian call: have a peaceful ceasefire, allow humanitarian convoys to reach everywhere in the Gaza Strip to save lives, to put an end to this war, and to save hospitals, to save every institution that is providing life for our people. Those are the best faces of the United Nations. And if they are in fact the best faces, which we truly believe and we express our gratitude to them, I believe we have to listen to everything that they have said and to listen to important call and requests: humanitarian ceasefire and humanitarian convoys up to scale, as the Secretary General requested, of a minimum of 100 truckloads every day. If we genuinely respect their calls and what they are doing, let us not only listen closely to them, but to implement their request. And with that spirit, allow me, Mr. President, to deliver my statement. Mr. President, Dag Hammarskjöld said, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created in order to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell." End of quotation. Gaza is now hell on earth. You've heard that not from me, you've heard it from Lazzarini and many others. Gaza is now hell on earth. Saving humanity from hell today means for the United Nations to save Palestinians in Gaza. The 2.3 million Palestinians living there are enduring suffering that no human beings should endure. They are besieged and bombed with nowhere safe to go. Again, you heard Lazzarini. He said there is no safe place in the Gaza Strip. Half the homes in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged. Gaza population is comprised of 70% of refugees, over 1.4 million Palestinians have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Again, Mr. Lazzarini. Now, virtually all of our people in Gaza are homeless, displaced, moving from one family home to another, from a hospital to a church, from a mosque to an UNRWA school, sleeping in their cars, sleeping in the streets, and still being killed wherever they go to convince them they will not be safe anywhere in Gaza. A leaked document prepared by the Israeli Intelligence Ministry confirms that, in fact, relocating Palestinians from Gaza to tent cities in Sinai is not a threat we imagined, but a reality Israel is trying to impose. They want to depopulate the Gaza Strip completely from the entire population and throw them in the lap of Egypt in the Sinai Desert. Over 8,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 3,000 in the south of Gaza, where Israel has forcibly transferred hundreds of thousands of people. These staggering figures keep rising with every minute that action is delayed to stop the onslaught against our people. One figure more than any other explains the magnitude of this man-made tragedy. 3,500 Palestinian children have been killed by Israel in just 3 weeks, more than the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones since 2019, according to Save the Children, as my sister, the minister from United Arab Emirates, Her Excellency Lana, has alluded to. Let me repeat, 3,500 Palestinian children have been killed by Israel in just 3 weeks, more than the annual number of children killed across the world's conflict zones combined since 2019. Every 5 minutes, a Palestinian child is killed. How many more days will you wait to say enough? How many more days will you wait to say enough? Paralyzed, not acting, not carrying out your duty to maintain international peace and security and to stop that war as a derivative of that. To recognize this is a war against our children. How long will it take you to recognize that thousands of children being killed before your own eyes and you're still paralyzed? Our children who are like yours, children of God, children of light, the angels on earth. Enough darkness, enough death. Save lives of our children and all children and the children of others. Mr. President, I think the country, you abstained, one voted no. This resolution must be immediately and fully implemented. If you were able to vote in the General Assembly, what is stopping you from voting here? The 11 who voted yes, the 3 who abstained, among them 4 permanent members voted yes and 1 abstention. Do what the bigger body is doing. Rise up to your responsibility and what you should do instead of dragging the paralysis, I don't know for how long, while thousands of Palestinian innocent civilians, including children, being slaughtered. The Security Council must take example of the General Assembly and its wisdom, and uphold its responsibilities to put an end to this bloodshed, which constitute an affront to humanity, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and a clear and imminent danger for regional and international peace and security. I want to thank the Arab group, led by my brother, Ambassador Mahmoud of Jordan, who has demonstrated an outstanding leadership in leading our group during this very difficult month. And we salute him, and the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and its foreign minister, who was with us, participating in what we've accomplished together with all of you, with many of you in the General Assembly. And the OIC member states for their relentless mobilization, the countries of the Global South for their support, as well as all the countries which engaged constructively and responsibly to allow us to adopt a substantive humanitarian resolution with overwhelming support from across the globe. 121 countries versus 14. Given that 11 members of this council have voted in favor of the resolution, that 3 abstained and 1 voted against, it is clear that the text enjoys broad support and must serve as basis for a clear and unequivocal position of the Council at this critical juncture. Mr. President, 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza face death every day and every night. Save them. Save them. Look at them as human beings. You cannot look only at one side and ignore this tragic humanity completely. Wake up from revenge. Look at us as human beings. Save them. We have 2,000 people under the rubble. Allow us to find them. Save those who still can be saved, and bury in a dignified manner those who have perished. Allow the 20,000 wounded to be properly treated. Allow doctors to fix broken bodies, and God to heal wounded souls. Allow humanitarian workers, the brave ones, the heroes, to perform their life-saving duties, even as they mourn their colleagues. 64 alone among UNRWA as staff killed in Israeli attacks. Allow them to conduct their sacred mission in safety and not under the bombs. Allow hospitals to resume their work to save lives and not be transformed into morgues. Allow members of the same families who have survived to embrace each other and to mourn their loved ones who did not. Allow us to pay the tribute owed to the families wiped off the face of this earth and whose names join the long list of bereaved families etched in our collective memory. Allow people who will have homes standing to go home, and allow millions of people to start thinking once more about how to rebuild their lives despite the depths of the death, devastation, and destruction they endured, despite the indelible traumas. Treat us as human beings with the respect we deserve. We are not subhuman beings. We are not from another planet. We are exactly like each and every one of you. We are humans, human beings, treat us in this manner with respect we deserve. Show respect for our inherent dignity, not in words, but in deeds, in action, in doing something to stop this crime against our people and our children and our women and our wounded and our sick. No one should justify our killing or find reasons to give more time to the killer. Call for an end of this assault on an entire nation. Stop the killings in the West Bank by settlers and occupation forces and the forced displacement underway there. Palestinians, as human beings, have rights that must be upheld, and they are entitled to protection, and we are entitled to be defended. Many of you talk about one narrative, about one state to defend itself. When our children are being killed, do we have the right to defend them? Do we have the right to defend our families? Do we have the right to defend our schools? Do we have the right to defend our mosques? Do we have the right to defend our churches? Do we have the right to defend our homes and our soil and our nation? Do we have rights? Or rights only the monopoly of one side? Our people have, as a people, rights that have long been denied and must now be recognized so we can all live in peace and security. No assault or war will ever end this conflict or resolve this injustice. It will only deepen and widen it. We have said time and time again, there is no military solution to this conflict. We are yet to demonstrate there is a peaceful one. And I listen to you all the time. And you tell me about the two-state solution. And you repeat it. And you repeat it. And you repeat it. But you don't tell me what single step you are willing to take in order to stop the other side from destroying the two-state solution before your eyes. Isn't it enough to wake up and say the resolution that you adopted that calls for the implementation of the two-state solution show resolve to implement these resolutions? You are the Security Council.
Of the General Assembly is called
Are you
to order.
continuing to be paralyzed, or you want to act on the advice you're giving me? You're giving the Palestinian people.
The General Assembly
Two-state
will
solution,
consider
we accept
Agenda
it.
Item 38
Implement it.
entitled
Who is stopping you from
Necessity
implementing it?
of ending the economic,
Who is stopping you
commercial,
from
and financial embargo
taking steps
imposed by
in
the
order
United
to
States of America
push the
against
occupation
Cuba?
to an end, to allow
The report
for
of the
the
Secretary General
independence
has
of
been
the state of
circulated
Palestine?
in
Who is stopping you?
A/78/84.
Don't keep repeating to me two-state solution.
In connection
Tell me
with
how
this
you are
item,
going to
the
defend
Assembly
it and how you
also
are going
has
to
before it
implement it.
a draft
So that
resolution
our people
issued as document
believe you and have faith in what you are saying
A/78/L5.
and respect what you call for when they see you marching toward the implementation, and whoever is standing on the path of the
I now give the
implementation
floor
of
to
your
the
will
distinguished
should be
representative
removed
of
from the
Singapore,
way so that we
speaking
can
on
see
behalf of the
the
Association of
implementation
Southeast
the two-state
Asian
solution.
Nations.
Based on your resolutions, based on international law, based on the terms of reference. You agreed to all these things, but you're not acting. You keep repeating them, and you think by repeating them, you did your duty. No, you have to do more. You have to
Mr.
take the
President.
practical steps for allowing
I'm honored to
the
address the General Assembly
become a reality.
on behalf of the 10 member states.
We
of
have
the
said time and time
Association
again,
of
I
Southeast
repeat,
Asian nations
there is no military
ASEAN,
solution to this conflict.
to express our support
We
for
are
the draft
yet
resolution
to demonstrate
contained in
there
document
is a peaceful one. Prove
A/78/L5
us wrong.
on the necessity of ending the economic,
Every
commercial,
minute counts.
and financial embargo
Every minute
imposed
is
by
the
the United
difference
States
between
of
life and
America
death for
against
Palestinians
the
in
Republic
Gaza.
of Cuba.
And I thank you very much, Mr.
ASEAN
President.
also
I
aligns
hope
itself
that there is a
with
short
the
period of
statements
time
to be
till the
delivered
end of
later
this,
by
your
Azerbaijan
presidency.
on behalf of the
But if by
non-aligned
any
movement
miracle
and
that you
by
can
Uganda
have
on
a
behalf
position
of the
from
Group of
the Security
77
Council to
and
stop
China.
this war and to allow the hundreds of
Mr.
trucks
President, the General
with
Assembly has
humanitarian
consistently
assistance to enter the
adopted
Gaza
this
Strip,
resolution
we will
by an
tip our hat
overwhelming
to you
majority
and to the
since it was
Security
tabled
Council
in
members.
1992.
And I thank you very much, Mr.
This
President.
is also the 8th year
that ASEAN has
thank-
made a statement at the General Assembly urging the United States to lift its economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba as soon as possible. Each year, almost all member states, including ASEAN, have stood for the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, namely sovereign equality, non-interference, and non-intervention.
Embargo against Cuba. 6 decades of the embargo have cost Cuba trillions of dollars. From the 1st of March 2022 to 28 February 2023, the blockade cost Cuba an estimated US dollars 4.87 billion in losses. The report stated that, and I quote, "The blockade has had an undeniable impact on the quality of life and on the services provided to the population," unquote. For example, US and foreign companies have declined or been unable to supply much needed medicines and equipment to Cuba. The Secretary General's report cited various US private initiatives to mitigate this and observed that the blockade imposed barriers to healthcare cooperation are, and I quote, "contrary to the will of the people of the United States," close quote. Yet it is unfortunate that 80% of Cuba's current population has only known Cuba under the blockade. Furthermore, the US's decision to place Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism in January 2021, in the words of the Secretary General's report, and I quote, "on the basis of inconsistent arguments and without evidence," unquote. This not only undermines the legitimacy of this wider global fight, it has also needlessly exacerbated the negative effects of the embargo on Cuba by deterring numerous companies and financial entities from engaging Cuba and providing services to its citizens. For example, the report noted that dozens of banks have suspended their operations with Cuba. It goes without saying, Mr. President, that the embargo also hinders Cuba's commitment to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Secretary General's report stated that, and I quote, "The embargo affects opportunities for national and local development and creates economic hardship for the population and has an impact on human development in general," unquote. At a time when the world has already fallen behind on the SDGs, powerful states should refrain from creating further obstacles to sustainable development. Mr. President, as the world faces pressing global challenges that require international cooperation, we encourage the United States and Cuba to engage in constructive dialogue, underpinned by mutual respect. ASEAN joins other members of this assembly to urge the United States to end its economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba as soon as possible, and to delist Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, and to take steps towards normalizing relations and to use its influence to create a rising tide to lift all boats. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the distinguished representative of Singapore speaking on behalf of ASEAN. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritania speaking on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver the statement on draft resolution A/78L5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba on behalf of the member of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC. It is particularly concerning that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba still remains in force after 6 decades. What is more critical is the fact during more than 30 years, the General Assembly has demanded unequivocally the end of the embargo by approving a draft resolution on the matter. Despite the overwhelming message the Assembly has sent on the previous occasion we have met, the embargo has not ceased but is stronger than ever. The embargo has only affected Cuba's commercial sector and national economic activities, but has also had disastrous humanitarian consequences for the Cuban population. The policy furthermore hinders the ability of other countries to invest in and trade with Cuba because of its extraterritorial effects. We are especially worried about how the impact of the embargo have exponentially increased after the inclusion of Cuba in the list of countries that allegedly sponsor terrorism. Due to this measure, banking operations as well as financial operations have become extremely difficult for Cuba, impeding this country to insert itself in the global supply chain. We call for the removal of Cuba from this list, which is incoherent with the large cooperation Cuba has traditionally provided to the global south. The embargo has a notable impact on the national health system in the difficulties encountered by national industry in purchasing the material need to preserve food and produce medicine and other products, given the existence restriction on Cuba against procuring goods containing more than 10% of United States component. The general situation remains a source of deep concern. We strive to work for the benefit of humankind and the well-being of our people. Our leader here at the United Nations agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals and committed to responding to the aspiration of the international community to ensure that no one is left behind. In that regard, the embargo against Cuba represents an obstacle to its people in achieving the Sustainable Development Goal and runs counter our commitment to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The ROC therefore joined the call of the overwhelming majority to end the embargo against Cuba. The ROC member states support the draft resolution A/78/L5 and call on member states to vote in favor of it, as they have done in the previous years. Thank you.
I should like to thank the distinguished representative of Mauritania speaking on behalf of the organization of the Islamic Conference. Before giving the floor to the next speaker, I would like to propose that the list of speakers for the debate on this item be closed in view of the large number of delegations inscribed on the list. Unless I hear any objection, I will take it that the Assembly agrees to close the list of speakers. It is so decided. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, speaking on behalf of the Latin American and Caribbean states.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the members of the community of Latin America and Caribbean states. CELAC welcomed the steps that were taken between 2015 and 2016 by Cuba and the United States to commence the process of normalizing their diplomatic relations, which began a new chapter in the history of peace and coexistence among nations of the Americas. However, we regret that the embargo remains a reality for the Cuban people and unquestionably continues to be the main obstacle of normal development in Cuba. The report of the Secretary General A/78/84 confirms the cost of the policy for Cuba, as it does substantial and unjustifiable harm to the well-being of the Cuban people, and is contrary to the desire for peace of the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, as set out in the Proclamation of Latin America and the Caribbean as a zone of peace. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba is contrary to the letter, spirit, purposes, and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and international law. CELAC reiterates its firm rejection of the application of laws and measures that are contrary to international law, such as the Helms-Burton Act, including their extraterritorial effects and the increasing persecution of Cuba's international financial transactions, which run counter to the political desires of the international community. We are also opposed to the unjust inclusion of Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which, in addition to being unsubstantiated, has increased the chilling effect of the embargo-related restrictions and worsened Cuba's chances of establishing commercial and financial relations with international partners. We urge the government of the United States to put an end to those measures. CELAC underscores its special declaration on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba, adopted at the 7th Summit of the Heads of State and Government of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, held in Buenos Aires, Argentina on 24th January 2023. In it, we requested that the government of the United States abide by the successive resolutions of the General Assembly and, in response to repeated calls from the international community, put an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. Furthermore, CELAC reiterates its deep concerns about the tightening of the policy and its rejection of the extraterritorial dimension of the embargo, which has had a severe impact on Cuba's international financial transactions and the welfare of the Cuban people. The Charter of the United Nations sets out rights, obligations, and principles, and have become part of the legal heritage of humankind as well as international law. They should not be violated or undermined by any member. Member states should modify their national and international actions in line with the rights, obligations, and principles set out in our Charter. The community of Latin American and Caribbean states strongly supports the adoption of draft resolution A/78/L.5 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. We underscore the inconsistency of applying unilateral coercive measures that are not supported by international law or by the letter, spirit, purposes, or principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We reiterate our call on the United States to respond to the appeal by the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, every region of the world and its own people, to put an end once and for all to the unjust embargo on Cuba. I thank you, Mr. President, and I now beg your indulgence as I will deliver a few additional remarks in my national capacity. Before beginning, allow me to align with the statements to be delivered on behalf of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, and that which I just delivered on behalf of the CILAC. Every year, by virtue of the resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, the General Assembly pronounces overwhelmingly in favor of Cuba. This text, since its adoption in 1992, reflects the membership's unwavering condemnation of the ongoing blockade imposed on Cuba. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines' opposition to the ongoing measures is founded on our steadfast advocacy of the bedrock principles of the multilateral order, which are enshrined unambiguously in the Charter of the United Nations, namely the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of a state. The equal application of and adherence to these principles, along with the others that have been entrenched in the Charter, play an indispensable role in safeguarding peaceful coexistence amongst nations. To this end, we underscore that the continued imposition of this embargo is not only a violation of the Charter and affront to international law, but also inhumane, unjust, and anachronistic. I apologize. We therefore appeal to the member states to honor their obligations under the Charter, to avoid promulgating and applying laws and measures that fall within those set out in the resolution. We further appeal to the states that have imposed such measures to undertake the necessary steps and actions required to repeal or invalidate them. We unequivocally reject the unilateral imposition of illegal and counterproductive measures by some states on others as responsible actors in the international community. Member states have a legal and moral obligation to oppose extraterritorial application of domestic policies which violate international law, the overarching framework that was curated and established to safeguard our peaceful and prosperous existence. Mr. President, as we look toward implementing the 20th for Sustainable Development, we recall leaving no one behind. The ongoing embargo is an unnecessary barrier to Cuba's ability to achieve these goals on the same footing as the international community. While we recognize the significant advancements that Cuba has made in areas such as healthcare and education,